doing with this?
So while we wait for them, so Erica's here.
Yeah.
Petrushka?
No.
Wayne is not. I will have those who are here just talk and look into the camera, please.
Okay.
That is awkward, but that's how we're going to do this. So this is me. I don't know. Can you see me?
Yeah.
I can't see me. I'm not sure why.
There's a viewing thing, so maybe you can click on it. It should be in your upper right.
Okay, so now that I can see me, I'm realizing I'm not looking at the camera. All right, does it look like I'm looking to the camera now or looking at you?
It does. It
You're
does.
looking forward. Yeah.
So that's how we have to talk, which is super odd. Let's see. Erica, you're here. I see you.
Oh, great.
Very. Anthony?
Alexandra.
He's having problems with his mic.
Anthony, we'll just mute ourselves.
Hold on. Yeah, there we go.
Are you able to do full screen?
No, because I'm on my iPad because I'm having problem using the link on my computer. It says it doesn't work on my computer, but it works on the iPad. I'm not sure what's.
Julio, rotate phone. Mr. Is it possible to put the iPad, how do you call it? Can someone help me with the word?
Sideways, panoramic mode.
Sideways, sorry. See if that does anything. Any idea, Julio, why he might be having trouble with the link?
I would have to see what error it gave him or something.
It doesn't work on my computer. It works on my iPad.
Can you take a photo of it and send it to Julio of what the screen tells you?
It says I'm not allowed.
Yeah, it might be. I have a question for you. Were you signed on your iPad and your computer simultaneously?
No, I wasn't.
All right, but then I think we're okay with the iPad, right?
Yeah, if you can see me, I'll just put some books up there.
Wayne is also having trouble getting online.
Who is?
Really?
Wayne.
Which is he using the link that was sent us today or the other one?
I'm using the link that was sent us this morning.
Are you guys logged into a Zoom account?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, if you're in, you should be, but you have to have logged into Zoom on whatever device you're using for you to go through.
I think I've done that many times this year, sir. So you know.
Wayne does like 5 times a day. I think. Can somebody email Wayne a panelist invite, a special panelist invite? From the web, or is that not possible?
Let me find that.
So yeah, Julio will take care of that. In the meantime, we'll finish mic check.
So who exactly are we missing? Give me the name so I can find their email.
Wayne.
Wayne, WAYNE. I'll just put it in the chat.
Okay.
Voila, I just sent it.
Another question is, will you all be doing your own PowerPoints?
I don't have PowerPoint.
Is anybody doing PowerPoints?
Yeah.
Tony is.
Yeah, I had, but I'm not quite sure how to do it from my iPad. So I usually do it on my computer.
You know what? Let's try another thing. Tony, we're going to try sending you another link. Julio, are you still there?
Yep, what's up?
Can you send Dr. Burgess just another link?
Okay. Emails. You guys probably have these.
Yeah, just so
Well-
because he would have access to his slides and that's on his computer.
I'll put his email in the private chat.
Might send him. Barrymore Boogs. Okay, so my advice would be have him close everything,
Hmm.
and I'll resend the link, and I'll see what happens. Okay, so
Darlene, I have a PowerPoint. Do you want me to mail it to you?
No, you don't have to. What I wanted to be sure is that you can share screen. Can you try to share screen now?
Okay.
go for it.
Screen. and Let's just see this. Can you see
Okay.
that? Just like a PowerPoint.
All right,
Okay.
that link worked.
Okay. Am I reverbing?
Or this is perfect. You can just put yourself on mute at the moment. It's because it's sharing your audio as well.
Okay.
Right. We're gonna.
That's not the PowerPoint, but I just wanted to make sure it works. Okay.
Okay, great. And then I just need to check. We're about to begin. Wayne, how are you? See if the mute is on.
Yeah.
Hear me
I-
now?
Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you. I just got in. There were two links. One worked and the other one didn't. So I'm in. I'm fine. Hello.
Hi. Are you sharing a slide?
No, I'm not sure. Am I what?
Sharing any PowerPoints, any images?
No PowerPoint, no images.
Okay. Lastly, Tony, can you please try to share your screen? We're like 1 minute from showtime. I'm just making sure that we are all good.
Go ahead. It's fine. It's too much problem to set it up. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Are you sure?
Absolutely. You go ahead. You go ahead. You're about 30 seconds from showtime, so go ahead.
I just who else? Are we good?
Darlene,
Yes.
when Tony presents, I can share my screen if you let me, and I can just do his PowerPoint.
So you are panelists, correct now?
Yeah, so I'm just on. I'm not showing myself view, but I think I can still share a screen.
Try to share screen quickly. We're about to begin.
Okay, hold on. I can see that I have the power to do it. Hold on. I just downloaded it 5 seconds ago. Give me a sec. Downloads. Hold on. Okay. Just a sec.
If we can put Julio, if you're there, if we can put the welcome slide back up so we can begin, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
The fancy one.
Yeah, and as you know, we'll put ourselves on mute unless we're speaking.
Okay, then you don't want me to share, but I can tell it will let me. So I have it all set up. I'm ready.
Wonderful. All right.
Okay, I'm muting myself.
And let us.
Julio, I'm sorry, this is Cecile. There's an updated slide that say bienvenue.
Okay, who has it?
Error. You should have it because bien accueilli is not Creole. Sorry.
1, 2. There's two with the very same name. Okay, I see what the
Called
problem is.
bienvenue. The very first word should be BYENVINI.
Yeah, okay, I see what happened. That one?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, it got lost in the
Yes, yeah.
chain. Good catch.
That's fine.
Okay, quick question. I'm sending a chat. Right.
Yes, Julio.
Okay, 1 second. Okay, Mark Schuler, Mark, you're up.
Bonsoir tout le monde, bon après-midi. Thank you so much for coming. Wanted to also, as President Baker say, thank you all for organizing this event and people for, the working sessions is a really unique opportunity to build Haitian studies in an interdisciplinary way from the bottom up. So we were going to do this before even there was a need to go online. So the fact that you all are very creative about putting it online is HSA owes you a great debt. So thank you all. And thank Julio and Darlene for making this possible technologically. I'm just going to be really happy to see how this goes. The session for me this morning, for some folks in Europe, it was this afternoon. We're spanning 9 time zones and 5 countries. So it was a very rich and productive conversation. We're very much looking forward to this. And with that, I'll just say welcome, bienvenue, merci, and I'm off.
Okay. We ready, Julio?
Yeah, have fun.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Merci, bienvenue tout le monde. Nous t'arrêtons di nou yon bienvenue et merci pour participation. We just want to welcome everyone, and I would especially like to thank our panelists. In the interest of time, we are not going to read their resume. All their bios are online. In the order that they will present, we have Jerry Philogène, Anthony Boggs, Erica Moya James, Petrushka Moise, and Wayne Modest. Basically, this is part of a larger project that Alessandra Benedicti-Kaken, who is, you're not seeing her face, but she is really the project coordinator, which means she puts all the details together and has been working for weeks with Darlene Zuduisson, who's the co-moderator with I, as well as Julio, who has spent literally countless nights to make this possible. So I want to first start off by acknowledging all their work and the work of the various HSC board members. I don't know who's here, but I know Mark Schuler, as well as Claudine Michel, and a whole host of other folks who have made this possible. So merci en pile, thank you, Aibobo. So when we introduce our colleagues who are art historians with different background to come to the table, we send them some questions, and these questions are meant to be just a way to start the conversation. They are by no means limited to them. We ask them to keep their comments to about 5 to 8 minutes short. And the questions are on the chat, but since I'm not sure everyone is seeing the chat, I'm just going to briefly read the questions to you so you can have an idea of where their comments and thoughts and provocations are coming from. The questions are, what are the disciplinary and institutional violences that belong both to the art and the ethnographic museum or gallery, placing, theorizing, and deliberating on certain objects as ethnographics and others as art? 2, how to grapple with the often exploitative relationship of contemporary art to that of art that is produced in contexts that refute the contemporary art market's fetishization of an elitist and heavily capitalized notion of art. 3, how can we render ourselves more responsible in our relationship to looking at, perceiving, and feeling Haitian art? So those were the questions. We will ask each of the panelists to give their thoughts, and Darlene and I will co-moderate the conversation with your comments and questions from the chat. Merci en pile. Thank you very much. I'll let Dr. Philogène take over.
All right, well, perfect. Well, merci beaucoup. Bien content là, bien content moi en pile bons amis, bien content faire connaissance de que moun que m'pa connaît. So this is a wonderful pleasure to be here. It's great to see some good friends, good colleagues, and to also meet some new ones. So I'm looking forward to our conversation within the next 2 hours. First, I'd like to thank 2 hours. Yeah. First, I'd like to thank everyone at HSA who put this together, because I know it was an amazing task. And I, for one, when I heard that HSA was still happening, I was pleasantly surprised, knowing the amount of work it takes to do this. I'd also like to thank Alessandra, Cecile, Carlo, Darlene, and Julio for all the wonderful work that they've done in putting this together as well. So first, I'm not going to start off by responding to the provocative questions that Cecile and Alessandra and Carlo put together. I'm actually going to respond to the description, let's say, of how this all came together. And I'm going to keep my comments very brief because I know we have a lot to talk about. So the description that I was reading in the text, it reads, the present project offers first and foremost a call to us as scholars, pedagogues, and publishers to be ever rigorous and conscious about the ways in which we engage in theory. I thought this was a very intriguing question because to actually think about theory, artistic practice, and the scholarship on Haitian art and visual culture, something that I've been doing for the past 20 years. So to actually put together a group of people, international, national scholars, to actually think about this, I think is a fruitful project, And then I wanted to respond to how might we think about more creative mechanisms, which I think was one of the questions also posed in the panel description, to better create a dialogue for artists and scholars and writers to think about Haitian art, or what we come to understand as Haitian art in Creole and in French. And I think first and foremost, spaces such as this, spaces where we're able to have conversations about Haitian art, Haitian culture, Haitian history are very, very important. And then I also think about other spaces where these conversations are necessary but may not be happening. So I'm thinking like places, or if they are happening, they're not happening at the level in which we would like them to. So I think about perhaps offering various types of interventions to places like the College Art Association, and thinking about the Cultural Studies Conference, thinking about the Caribbean Studies Association, associations that are very much engaged in art, culture, heritage, and then, but also thinking about these institutions as they speak about Black diasporic art. So where can we intervene in these spaces? So for me, it's really about how can we engage in these spaces, not only HSA, but also other places that we might not necessarily see ourselves as part of the discourse. Then I thought about 4 other interventions, and these are interventions that I think that we all in our work have been thinking about. I'm thinking about the idea of scholarship and citation, and this comes from my work, but also some of the works of some of the panels here, but also thinking about the interview and the conversation you had with Carlo, Cecile, yesterday, or I heard it yesterday, and I listened to it yesterday, and I was thinking about the idea of citation and publication. And not only translation, but the importance of citation, actually continuing the conversation so that it is inserted in a variety of other texts, so that it is an ongoing process. Then I started also thinking about archives and what we imagine and consider as archival. And I'll talk a little bit about this later on, but I'm thinking about the collection of Radio Haiti. And the collection is a digital collection held at Duke and put together by Laura Wagner. In that text, in that archive, there are rich, rich, rich interviews with Haitian artists, musicians, theorists, individuals who were engaged in the moment of creation, of creating art. So I think for us to think about spaces where we can also get that issue, get those concerns and issues. And then I also started thinking the third thing of publications and exhibitions, because it's very important to have exhibitions, but it's also very, very important to have catalogs, to have material that lasts longer than the exhibition. When the exhibition comes down, it's gone. So I think that these offer us an opportunity to extend the conversation, enhance it, but also add to it. And lastly, I think what has been playing my mind a lot is the idea of collecting. And not only by museums, because that's always what we imagine, but also by collectors. Because what tends to happen, collectors leave their collection to museums. And they also show their collection in a variety of different ways. So those are just the things that I'd like for us to think about along the lines of the other questions that you posed, Cecile, but also if we imagine to actually enter into a scholarly discourse about the scholarship of Haitian art. So I'll stop it at that and let my other colleagues, speak. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll let Darlene continue.
Thank you so much. Those are really rich questions for us to continue to think with. And next we have with us Anthony, who I'm unable to find you, but it's all yours. Thank you. I think perhaps you're on mute.
Yep, that's okay. It's all of this is the new world of Zoom. So that's well, not quite new yet because of its time. We have been in for what, 7 months. Let me begin by saying thanks very much for inviting me to be on this really important panel. And I think that both the occasion of the panel as well as the questions posed are real significance for us to be thinking about Haitian art and the scholarship around Haitian art. So what I wanted to do in my brief remarks is to think a little bit about the so-called theoretical question and to answer that question with reference to some other people's work, but to suggest that the question of theory and so-called art theory, which will then contribute to what one might call an unconventional art history, or non-universalist art history, really emerges, I would argue, from a set of practices that the artists themselves do, and that we would want to we would want to think very hard about those practices, and particularly as we engage in the business of archiving, and trying to develop new sets of archives from which different theoretical formulations, may emerge. I begin with Edouard Glissant and what he says about two things: what he says about history, Caribbean history in the 1960s, and what he says about Haitian painting. For Glissant, in his 1960 article, Quarrel with History, this is what he notes about history. He says, as far as we are concerned, quoting Edouard Glissant, history as consciousness at work and history as lived experience are therefore not the business solely of historians exclusively. I think that's really very important, because while Glissant argues in this particular essay, published in Caribbean Discourse, for literature as one site in which you can then begin to think about Caribbean history, I would like to argue that Haitian art is actually the other site in the Caribbean for us to think through Caribbean issues of Caribbean history. On Haitian painting, this is what Gleason says. Haitian painting works through, I would argue, a process of accumulation. And Gleason develops this particular point of accumulation by saying that Haitian art is a pictorial discourse which proceeds by piling up the visible. And I think the phrase that I like in this particular quote is the piling up of the visible, right? And how is the visible piled up to actually create some kind of pictorial discourse? So that's my first point. My first point is about this process of accumulation and what Glissant would call the piling up of the visible. My understanding and the preoccupation is really how does the piling of the visible works both at the level of the aesthetic and at the level of the political, specifically in relationship to the matter of history. What I want to when thinking about history, I want to just briefly refer to Michel Roth-Chouliau, remarkable book on, which is not about history, but is really about historiography. And one of the most remarkable books, I think, about historiography. And the way in which he talks about the relationship between actors and the enactment of things, and then the narration of the enactment itself. And therefore, to argue as he does that history is a certain kind of narrative form about these enactments. And if they are narrative forms about the enactments, and the enactments becomes history with a capital, with a common H, and then the narrative form becomes history with a capital H, then the question of that we face in the Caribbean is really about how do we narrate that history. And if you follow Glissant, he would, and do literature, then obviously there's Texaco by Patrick Chamoiseau, and then there's obviously Edwidge Danticat Farming of the Bones as two sets of contemporary examples about the business of thinking about history, but from the true literature. But my simple proposition is really this, that the Haitian art and what Glisson calls the pictorial discourse is really, quite frankly, a historical discourse, not just a simple pictorial discourse, but also that it is not historical in the conventional sense of what some people would call art history, art history, or the history, or history paintings in art, a kind of 17th century thing that comes out of the French Academy that deals with business of mythologies, the Bible, and daily life and landscape, but is also obviously grounded in forms of portraiture. Or a kind of historical art that comes out of both the British, the French, and the Dutch Empire, in which this historical art is really about a sort of form of documentation, which can really be seen both documentation and actually setting up systems of classification. And you can see the systems of classification established through the Castor paintings that were done in Mexico. So that which was a way to think about color in the New World, and how the New World population should now be reorganized along a certain kind of color schema. And there are about 2,000 of those paintings that began in the 1700s, and that goes through well into the 1800s. Gerald Alexis and Carlos himself, who's part of the who's an organizer of this, makes the point though that there is in early Haitian painting the dominance of, particularly from the Revolution, the dominance of portraiture. What I would want to suggest though is that we want to think about different currents of historical paintings in Haitian art, which then complicate the actual ways in which art history thinks about historical painting. I don't want to propose any long kind of theoretical framework, but this is what, and I don't like to talk about typologies, because those of you who in this panel who know my work I think that typologies are really abstraction from the real, and don't actually mean anything in social, artistic, and cultural and real life. But what I want to do just for this particular presentation is just to say the following. That if you think about 20th century conventional historical paint, not conventional, 20th century historical paintings in Haiti, then we would obviously, we work with, folks like Philomene Aubin, who makes the point that what he's doing is a history. I mean, he's explicitly clear about what his particular practice is. You're looking at works, obviously, of Andre Pierre, and the way he thinks about the laws, the way he thinks about the revolution and the laws, his remarkable painting about Guinea, about the laws leaving Guinea after the Macon Revolution. You're looking at Aldrich Pierre's work on Mackindal and his remarkable work on the revolution itself. And then you're looking at just hundreds of paintings about the August 1st, 1791, Boyce Common sermon. I mean, you have your choice of which one you like on Danson. But there's a way in which, therefore, the question of history thinks through the business of the Haitian Revolution. Or you're looking at the hundreds of paintings of Toussaint L'Ouverture. This obviously is a historical discourse. And what it does, in my view, is that it creates a visual historical grammar about Haiti and its history. And that confirms Glisson's points that really Caribbean history should not be left to the historians. A lot of the compositional form of these paintings, obviously, are portraitures, and this particular genre, I would want to argue, continues. But I would also want to suggest in my last point that there is a turn in the works of a couple of persons that we might want to think. That is, they're looking at history, but they're also trying to deal with it in a different way. And I want to just look very quick, and I just going to list them as I go along. The work of Edward Duvall, his work particularly on memory windows, where he does what I like to call a kind of archaeology of images. And to do that archaeology of images, he does it within resin and so on, but it is also a kind of embedded history. History is embedded within the actual piece itself. The work of Tessa Mars, who was on a panel earlier on her remarkable work the transformation of Dessalines into Tessaline. And what does that mean for the transformation of a revolutionary hero into a contemporary female figure, and her work or various images that just produced around that. The work of Ralph Allen, who's here, I just put up a couple of his pieces. Part of it we did for a show in Colorado about 2 years ago, and so on. Who really works, in my view, on contemporary history, and thinks very hard about Haiti and the contemporary life of Haiti, but through historical lens. And then the work of a young man from Jacmel, Laurent Renaud, whose really remarkable work does what he calls abstract expressionism. And this is a work which is called The Slave Ship, which was done for a particular exhibition that some of us did with him, and to actually take Jerry's point that we did a catalog for, because I agree with you. Every single thing some of us have done with Haitian art, no matter how small it is, if it is one room, we have attempted to catalog it. And not only have we attempted to catalog, we attempt to do the interview of the artist, it's him or herself. So to make sure that there's some kind of archival record. What we are witnessing, therefore, with just this really very small sampling, is there is a certain kind of history that is not the kind of just the representation of revolutionary heroes or aspects of the revolution or aspects of daily life. What we are witnessing here, I would want to argue, is a certain kind of juxtaposition, a certain kind of relationship of the past to the present, the way in which the past and the present collide, a certain kind of readaptation and reinterpretation of the past. And that reinterpretation and readaptation, I would argue, is pressed upon us by certain questions and what I like to call questions of the flesh that actually press upon us in the present. So therefore, my argument very simply is that what you're looking at in this turn, and and I don't like to periodize the term, but we could talk about that in this particular turn, is the way in which historical paintings have, there's a new current of historical painting in which what people try to do is to confront the past as a certain kind of event. It is therefore means, in my view, to theoretically think through this, is to think about history and to think about Haitian art, is to think, and Caribbean art, I would want to argue, is to think about a certain kind of history that lives, to think about a history of today, what I've called as a certain kind of living history in which we have to confront we have to confront both the past and the present. So to think, and then I would just end to say, all of this, I have come to, not, as I like to say to folks, not from sitting down in my study, but actually from some kind of deep engagement with the artists themselves, and trying to think through what is it the artist is doing in conversation with him or her, and then trying to think about it as some kind of, so-called scholar, trying to think about, okay, what does it mean for us, particularly as Caribbean people. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And you hit it right on the nail. This is part of this larger project that Alessandra, Carlo, Celius, and I are trying to do. We're trying to really put the artists at the center, and this is just the beginning, because I just have to say, part of this project stem out of my anger when I was at a College Art Association conference about 2 years ago, and I am in an audience on Haitian art, and a certain quite well-known person who works on Haitian art and trained students said, there are no Haitian art historian. And I thought I was going to lose my stuff. So we'll have a larger conversation about that. But I am so happy, to hear that. And we want to continue these conversations with the artists at the center. So I want to invite Professor Erica Moya James to continue. Thank you.
Unmute.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I want to do a very British thing and say protocol having been established. Thank you for taking the time to coming and being a part of this panel today, everyone. It seems like we're up to 50 participants. And thank you, Cecile, Alessandra, and Darlene for inviting me to be a part of this. I, like Jerry, I think I'm going to echo Jerry's and Tony's statements to some degree. I think I took the questions that was sent to me and I made notes almost immediately and put them away, and then I forgot to print them. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, I think you have me in the middle and I'm a middle child, so I'm about to, I think we fight for attention. So I think I'm going to say some things that hopefully will get someone mad, and so that we can have a really good conversation. So I'm just going to make some short comments about my practice. I mean, things that I believe as an art historian, things that how I approach my concerns right now as someone who studies and writes on Haitian art. And I'm going to start in Jamaica. Basically, last year, I was at the National Gallery in Jamaica, and I had this amazing conversation with the curatorial staff about literalness, literalness in Jamaican art and Caribbean art more broadly, and how that concept really presents itself in ways that can be unexpected. We were assessing work for a national exhibition. There were lots of literal works, around us, but there were also some, works that really used that concept in a way that was really interesting. And in other ways, work that could use a little bit more seasoning in terms of deploying that to aesthetic and political effect. Now, I want to begin here because as an art historian, I find that when I'm engaging Haitian art, the concept of literalness What you see is what you get, end of story, has impacted, I think, the discursive potential of the field that we're trying to establish. I think, and it's also impacted in some ways the kind of writing, the art writing that we see being done on the work of modern and contemporary artists. Personally, I would like to see Haitian art history wiggle out of some of the tried and true frames of looking that dominates it, that has dominated the investigation temporally, historically, and critically, partly because I view it, I think in some cases it's run out of gas. You know, I think we need to start looking in some other spaces and asking some different questions in order to push, take the field in a direction where it needs to go. So for me personally, one of the things that bothers me is the continued centering of Haitian art history on the 1940s story. I think it's time for us to, I'm personally interested in a longer history of representation of artistic practice in Haiti, and the manner in which, I think I'm aligned with Tony in this, the manner in which I believe that long history enunciates a kind of indigenous vision of modernity, you know, something else that's happening if we take it out of that sort of this re-emerging moment and sort of consider history in a longer sort of line, or not, because I believe in nonlinear art history, but we can get to that later. You know, but really dedicating to us, I mean, sort of thinking beyond that sort of moment, that discursive moment that in a sense we've all been in dialogue with for the last 50, 60 years. I also want to see us turn our backs on a kind of reductive, a kind of indexical, and almost rote manner that Vodun is referenced in Haitian art, as well as the blanket assumption that all Haitian artists are working directly from this fact. You know, I think that's a little bit, we've taken that as far as that can go. I think we need to question that a little bit more. And I think if we go back to what Cecile was talking about, and you'll hear me repeat this over and over again, looking at the artwork for the theoretical form in which to engage it, rather than applying, maybe we can start to sort of open things up a bit. So I'm interested in seeing art historians really engage the manner in which artists redeploy Vodun as a conceptual idea to mount contemporary critique, you know, through their work. You know, that's what I want to see. I want to see, I think in process, we can give Vodun the credit it deserves as a critical imaginary beyond the fantastic. You're talking about ethnography, et cetera. We can talk about that later. But part of that, I think, is on the emphasis of on the fantastic. And what if we think about Vodun as a critical imaginary? And what if we think about it in a way where we examine through the work how artists are, you know, sort of engaging that and redeploying that critically. A couple of years ago, Sidney Jenkins invited me to Ramapo College to write on a little show he was having of Jonathan Demme's work in Northern Haiti. And I was really, and it was a really important process to me because once again, literalness came into play. When I first looked at the work at first glance, I think it began to surprise me because in one dimension, the work was very quote unquote literal, which is, you know, but the longer I looked at the work, the longer the time spent, you know, truly engaging and looking and spending time with the work, the more I realized the manner in which some of the artists were using the literal to seduce and draw me in, but then to make a critical turn. And I want us as art historians and art writers coming from whatever disciplinary practice that we're coming from to really allow the work to make that turn, you know, to, in a sense, engage it at a deeper level and ask that second question. Now, how do we do this? How do we move through this? Now, for me, the question of archives that both Jerry and Barry brought up is important to me. And I think we need to establish better linkages between visual archives, the kind of work that Patricia and Fredo, and they're starting at Grinnell. We need to really support the work of like Hadassah, Saint Hubert, you know, those kinds of linkages. But for me, who I'm writing right now, things aren't happening fast enough. And I am like, and I'm often frustrated, you know, as a writer, accessing a lot of the archives that are there. Right now, I am hunting for work, for imagery for imagery that documents the 1957 election of Francois Duvall, right? Photography, anything that I could find, something that documents visually the 1980 arrival of Pope John Paul to Haiti. And these are seminal events, right, in Haitian art history. But I mean, in Haitian art and visual culture, as Jerry would say. But I'm having a really hard time finding that visual documentation, that visual archive. And so what does that mean for me as a writer? The first response is, of course, damn it, this is going to take me forever to never to write if I'm depending on trying to find these things. But my next level question is, why am I having difficulty, right? Why is it that this, what does it mean that there's this preponderance of the absence of visual documentation of some of these events in the Haitian archive? And Haiti was one of the first places in the Americas to receive the daguerreotype. You would think that there's a history of visualization through photography, for instance, there. But it isn't there. How do I begin to ask questions that take me beyond the literalness of my condition the conditions that I find myself in as a scholar? And in a sense, think about this absence as perhaps intentional, in a place where, how can I say, the imaginary was, or the image, and was weaponized at some point, because the imaginary is so much more important. Like Tony, I am obsessed with certain things as an art historian as well. And the obsession with the revolution, the obsession, the seeming obsession in Haitian production with the leadership portraiture, with images of Dessalines, images of Toussaint Louverture, all of this. But, I was really interested, for instance, looking at Ulrich Jean-Pierre's work in his, I think in the interview that was posted of him, the image was of the revolution. But my first thought, besides, here, this is a part of this genre that's very Haitian in so many ways, as an art historian, I then thought, wow, here is this contemporary artist channeling Courbet from 19th century French art. Why is he doing this? What is the sort of critical capacity of that sort of echo? And how does that, in a sense, allow us or provide us with a certain kind of methodology to sort of engage the past, histories of representation, et cetera? So these are some of the things that I think we really should, in a sense, be paying attention to in this moment as we sort of write this thing, the history of the past and the history of the present in this moment. And in closing, I just want to say that I would like to see Haitian art history, Haitian artists in Haiti, Haitian artists in the diaspora, really the work that we do on them pushed beyond the literalness of the image and the object. I would like to see a more conceptual approach to the past, a penetration beyond the skin of history, because in my mind, the space, place, and imaginary of Haiti, what drew me to it, I think, is that it can teach us something. There's something really important to teach us, not in a way where we map dominant narratives and practices onto the object, but in a way where we respect the work as art, and the artist as thinking agents, thinking beings. And I want us to inhabit the place and create a field, I think, where the work is the center of our regard, where the point of departure of our engagement and the theoretical form that reshape what we call epistemes, how we think we know what we know, right? And that it reshapes all of that, as well as the capacity, I think, of our critical imaginary. So I'm going to end there, and hopefully I didn't make too many people upset. Bye.
Erica, thank you so much. I'm hearing a lot of threads with citation, exceptionalism, and literalness. For me, really thinking about the ways in which these tropes lend to this exceptionalist discourse, that renders Haiti outside the space of the theoretical, and how it seems that even not being able to find visual representations is kind of part of this project. particular project. I would love to hear, we are moving on to Patricia Moise. Please.
We're here. Hello, everyone.
That's hard to find. Yes.
Again, thank you for the invitation. It's such an honor. And I am going to share, hold on. Yes. And so Erica, you're going to get some pushback from the firstborn. But also I don't think so much of it a pushback as you, when you started to talk, I was thinking, did I check the boxes for myself and when I did my work? But it's such an honor to be here today with all of you. I feel like I'm the newbie on the block. I just completed my doctorate and I'm still in that zone. But in the zone of really understanding that as an artist, to be a Haitian artist is to be a Haitian historian. And it all plays together. And I wanted to kind of show you in the sense of the direction that I've been spending past couple of years and continue to move forward. My work and my view of things really looks at how do we go beyond provenance? How do we go beyond the naming of the piece, beyond the naming of the work, the basic information that provenance has provided for us, because that is even a challenge in itself to finding that of Haitian art. And so my direction of addressing, when I saw these three questions, I said I couldn't possibly answer all three effectively without sounding like I was a runaway train. So I tried to take a stab at the second question, which is how to grapple with the often exploitive relationship of contemporary art to the art that is produced in context that refutes the contemporary art market's fetishism of the elitist and the heavily capitalized notion of art. And that really was the approach of my thesis of looking at is to what is the identity of the Haitian artist once we start to peel back the layering of colonialism, imperialism, and all the isms that have been put onto that. And there was that frustration, just as Erica has just mentioned, of where do I find this information? How do I find this information? Once that I realized that maybe the way that I was raised contributed to my limited access to my own culture, but also once I got into the ivory tower, how ill-equipped my university was in supporting my research and how difficult it was even to connect to other universities, even though I was given license to. And so I thank so much, and I don't know how to say this enough, to HSA for having the conference in New Orleans where all I had to do was get into the car, go down the street and find my tribe. So in doing so, it really made me being able to tap into scholars, being able to tap into this world, a way of looking at the Haitian artist, a way of responsibly peeling back the layers. But I wanted to as well get away from the tunnel vision of the 1940s, the tunnel vision that everyone believed that DeWitt started it all. But of course, you can't encompass all of Haitian history to show our markers. So I had to limit myself from the occupation to the Gudu, and looking at it in 3 different periods of time. So as I put together these works, it was hard to find the information, the text, the interviews, and thank you for Radio IET, but still, I really wanted to see how Haitians in the contemporary were looking at that. And what I was able to do was to go to the artists and allow them to control the narrative, not to go into only just the gallery critiques or the institutional critiques, but really engaging the artist to go from just being criticized to having the dialogue of where were they going, what were they thinking. So in my process of research, I created a theory called metamorphic, where I looked at the potomita as a symbolic process of where we're not looking at the end product of the artist, but we're looking at their product making. We're looking at the environment that they create for themselves to investigate their own forms of art, their own identity in their art. And so I utilize, as you can see here on this screen, jeté de l'eau, which is pouring of water and ceremonial libations. I utilize augmented reality in my exhibition and in my delivery of the art, because of the fact that one of the things that we challenge and we grapple with is access, and geographic access being the first one. So in my dissertation, I try to utilize AR as a way of introducing my art, but also layering it with other contemporary Haitian artists, where I was able to bring four other artists into the space with me to discuss how we narrate ourselves through the Haitian experience, and how we don't try to separate ourselves, but we encompass all of the historical trauma and drama that has narrated Haitian history throughout time. So in that process of bridging the artists from Rosemary de Rousseau, I was also able to introduce Florine Desmontais, Tessa Mars, and Stéphane Arbois. And through being able to bring in through different applications, bring them into the space where not only were we able to see the work that they've done, the impact that they've had, but I was able through my metamorphic process to look at them through how did they address the trauma of the time period that they were looking at. So I was trying to build a landscape, a kind of like a map beyond just their work, but how their artwork were indicators, they were markers of time, of experiences, their disruption to the natural order. And what I call a disruption to the natural order is a lot of the times in our upbringing of understanding who we are is by identifying what we are not. And so in that process, we look at what is making us, what is disrupting our environment. And then by understanding what is disrupting the environment is by understanding how far does this disruption go? So we reach out and we try to translate the landscape. And these artists have been able to apply their artistic techniques to develop processes in responding to the change. And by responding to that change, they're transforming the narrative. And once they elevate in the response, they elevate their perspective. But at no point in time do we go by the Western philosophy, and this is just like, this is my personal opinion, which I'm trying to make fact, is that we don't do relax, relate, release. We encompass all of that, and we make that our potomita, and we build off of that. And by that, that's how we elevate our perspective and are able to have a better understanding of the things that are happening to us. And I don't want to get it misconstrued, because I feel like sometimes the word resilience is overused or misused, but I feel that it gives us our strength as artists by being able to translate what we have come to understand as our experiences. But what brings the Haitian signature to whatever art form we choose to use is the process in which we work in our studios. So by looking at De Rousseau, Florine, and also conversing with them, I was able to break down each of their processes, each of their time periods, looking at their art forms and understanding how they came to develop their contribution to art history. And also translating that to myself in seeing how it is that I am defining myself as an artist and as an art historian. So in conclusion to my presentation is that by marking our spaces, we are building a map that helps us to reduce the degrees of separation that has been created by power, shame, and isolation that people regurgitate in the history of Haitian experience. So I look forward to our engagement and our discussion on this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moise. I am super excited about the work you are doing at Grinnell College. I'm looking forward to the collection and making it accessible to not only scholars of Haitian studies in the US, but around the world and especially Haiti. So I look forward to more conversations, and I know Carlo is excited as well. So before we continue the dialogue, we have one last speaker, which is Wayne Modest, who's here with us from the Netherlands. I think it's almost 9 o'clock there. So we are literally transforming into different time zones. So Wayne, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you, and thanks again. And I do the British condition of saying what Erica said. All thanks have been said, and I concur with these thanks. In a way, I thank you while I am going to be very cautious, because as I listened, I'm getting upset at Alessandra for getting me involved in this, thinking, what the heavens have I done to say yes to this conversation? But I wanted to start out, seeing that this is just not the area of my ongoing work. I wanted to start out by doing, just to suggest that what I want to engage with was not even, again, like everybody else, not the question. But at the end of the theoretical outlay, you had one really beautiful statement where you said, as Celine insists, we refuse to define. I want to take that part out, as we refuse to define. Because I'm interested primarily within this context from an ethnographic perspective. And as many of you will know, museums like the one I sit in the Netherlands are under fire right now. You've seen it all over the papers. There are activists walking out with objects from out of the collections, those kinds of things. So we're in a specific moment right now in trying to reimagine what these institutions can become. But one of the projects that I've been involved in ever since I've started to work with these kind of museums, especially in Europe, is actually a certain kind of, I would want to call it an absence of Haiti. I'm interested in that absence of Haiti as archive and what is at stake in that absence of Haiti within the ethnographic imagination in European ethnographic museums. And why would that be so? I think that coincides a little bit with some of the things that Jerry and Erica mentioned. But I'm interested in that primarily because I want to ask whether or not there is actually an intellectual yield to be gained by being absent, and whether or not that absence is something that is more productive than we make it out to be within the conception of how anthropology and art and anthropology have tried to conceptualize the Caribbean, have tried to conceptualize Haiti. So my first engagement with Haiti in Europe was when I worked in London at a small museum called the Horniman Museum. And forgive me, my intention here is to critique nobody. It is just a set of thoughts. And so when I worked there, they had an installation of three what would be called voodoo. Somebody sending me something. Spaces in the museum. 3, what would that be called now? Some kind of shrines. And it was funny because students would always put a lot of pencils through the shrines. They were just filling it up all the time. That's what they found interesting about it. But in engaging with the curator at the time, I asked him, what other stories of Haiti can we tell? And his response was, there is no Haiti. There's no other story to Haiti but voodoo. That's the first thing he said to me. My second engagement was with another, this was more an art historian, an artist who was working very closely to what is now called the Ghetto Biennale. And we had an engagement around that concept as well and what it had stake in that. And forgive me again, as I say, I'm no art historian, but I was myself both intrigued by the conceptual argument that that work was supposed to do and pushed back against it as a logic. And the pushing back was exactly how the anthropological conception of what the ghetto could be and become became the narrative through which Europe knows Haiti, knew Haiti. And then I moved to the Netherlands in 2010. And at the time I came, I think just at the end of an exhibition called Voodoo, which was actually a usual kind of ethnographic exhibition. Darker than that you could not get. You could hardly see because it was so dark. Because that is how the ethnographic stages Haiti. So my interest then in this conversation is to ask a little bit about what it might mean to refuse the intellectual, the epistemic, but also to refuse the conceptions of the Caribbean that are presented in museums like mine. What does it mean to refuse these limited category? And even if it is a category, because I like the argument that everybody brings up, which is the idea of art and the writing of history. But I'm also troubled by whether or not we presuppose another categorical formation for what Haitian art needs to be, and whether or not that restricts it again to a possibility of uselessness. And by that I mean uselessness not in the bad sense, but uselessness in a good sense. That there is something about, even as we try to release Haiti from those earlier categorization, I wonder if we do not reinscribe it with new ones that binds it up again to do the work that we think it needs to be done. So I go back to my earlier formation. Almost all ethnographic museums in Europe have nothing from the Caribbean. What they have from the Caribbean are natural history specimens, and they have archaeology of people presumed dead. But Black life is missing, almost all of them. And the important thing for that, because when I started to look at that, I was a little bit saddened. I thought, okay, why is there such a preponderance of objects from Papua and the Pacific and all of the Pacific and wherever, but there's nothing of the Caribbean? So my presumption at the time was that the Caribbean had actually escaped the anthropological in the primitivizing sense that ethnographic museums were doing at the time. They had escaped it because the Caribbean confounds the very categories of how anthropology was being developed in a material sense in museums, because it could not appeal to the concepts of the primitive as the anthropology was trying to appeal to in its collecting tenure. David Scott writes beautifully in an article speaking to Sidney Mint's work, where he says we were neither fish nor fowl, neither anthropological enough to get into anthropology, historical enough to get into history, nor were we art historical enough to get into art history. But my question that I want to really, this is all I want to pose to you is, what is that tension in between a refusal, as Bob Marley says, to be what you wanted us to be, on the one hand, and therefore a refusal of the archive as a form of entrapment, and Erica's longing for an archival that helps us to be able to tell certain stories differently. How do we meander through that tension of refusal and absence that could help us to think otherwise about the Caribbean as space, as history? Actually, I would want to suggest the Caribbean as theory, because there is something for me there that is as theoretically sweet, senses, quite exciting about that, where that tension lies. And I'm not necessarily out of it yet. One of the answers to that is exactly what Tony might suggest, or anybody have suggested, or what Johannes Fabian would have suggested in his 1970 book, I think, representing the Remembering the Present. That's the name of the book, where he works with the works of this Congolese artist called Chimumba, and thinking through how Chimumba helps to write particular histories. So perhaps there is a yield to be gained there to think about these practices of history writing. But I still want to ask this question about how might we think differently about that escaping the archive as something that is theoretically robust rather than something that is a lack or a loss. Perhaps Haiti, in escaping that kind of archival practice, a 19th century one in my sense actually, what it did was it escaped anthropology's prison, which is what many of us are probably trying to put it back into, anthropology's prison. So that is where my provocation would be. And to end very boringly, very, very boringly, to be honest with you, as a person who is themselves boring in Caribbean, writing archives and thinking, one of the things I'm looking for desperately, personally, is that I've been working for a long time in something that Jamaica did very arrogantly in the end of the 19th century. In 1891, it decided that it would not be outdone by any other place that was going to do what is called a great exhibition. So it hosted its own great exhibition in Jamaica and invited people to come. And I've been trying to find comparative archives of late 1890s work where different parts of the Caribbean were participants in these exhibitions exactly because they were pushing against the progressive taxonomies of man that these exhibitions were to do. And if any of you can tell me how I can find that for Haiti, I'd love you dearly. That is all I have to say. And I'm happy to be a part of the conversation. We refuse to be what you want us to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wayne. I think we should start there before we take it for questions from the chat. I don't know, Darlene, if you've seen questions, but I think this is a good way. This is a good way to start. How do we think differently? I like that provocation to question the lack, but to also make other suggestions. So any of you who wants to take that on, Wayne's provocation, let's start with that.
Oh, that was my intention. I wish you would start otherwise and I could hide. Yeah.
Could I push back a bit on this archive question? Because we have an idea of the archive as a place of storage, and the ways in which we, myself as some kind of historian, would always try and first go for, what Erica says, where's the material, where's the archive for this, so that we can do this, or we can search for whatever we need to search for. And Wayne himself was asked for an archive of Haiti that he can do comparative pieces of work. But I also think it might be important to think about the archive not just as storage, but actually a creation of discourse and ideas. So that when you say, one says there is the archive of Haiti is not represented in Europe, that you may not have the archive of storage, but what you have is an archive about the idea of Haiti and what is the significance of the meaning of Haiti. And therefore, it is what Stuart would call a kind of conceptual mapping. And so how does Stuart Hall, so how does the actual conceptual mapping, which is passed on through discourse and all sorts of things that we know about, representations and so on, something that particularly happens if you look at in European art, particularly so-called popular art, what was done on teacups and saucers and image and photographs and so on after the Haitian Revolution. The plethora of those things that painted Haiti as a place of horrors, which was done particularly in Germany, which would allow Mr. Hegel to begin to Haiti to come to his attention, or one of the things that allowed it to come to attention. Or if you actually look in the Dutch papers, some of the Dutch papers after the revolution, you would see the actual plethora of arguments about the revolution and a set of arguments between, say, planters in Jamaica quarreling with the people in the Netherlands, say, why are you writing this about the revolution? Don't you know what it will mean for us in Jamaica and in your colony in Suriname, what it will mean and so on. So there is, so to me, the material objects may not be there in the anthropological and ethnographic sense, but there is this idea of Haiti as an archive. And some of us have written about this, about what is the idea of Haiti as an archive that then saturates knowledge, all forms of knowledge production, and therefore creates, if you wish, a certain kind of understanding of Haiti itself. So I think it's important that we expand the notion of the archive. I myself think that is important for those of us who are working now, particularly in Haitian art and in other fields, to make sure that there's quote unquote some archive of storage. Not that it is actually will be it should not be the only one sort of thing, but that I think is important to just expand the notion of archive, to think about archive as also as what Stuart would call a form of conceptual mapping. My second point is really very quick, that I think that it is important that for me, I think questions of categorizations, the other categorizations are important. But what I would want to suggest, in the spirit of what Wayne just says, is to recognize that whatever other forms of categorization that we are doing are actually temporary. They are temporary because my argument is 10, 20 years, 15, 20 years down the line. Somebody will come and say, but hold on, Erica and Bogues and Jerry, what they were thinking, they don't understand this thing, right? To always think about the problem with Western thought and Western epistemology is that classification schemes become abstract, rigid, universalist, and permanent. what I think is important to think about, or categorizations actually emerge, but are always tentative, are always approximations, what Stuart would call approximations, always allowing us to try and think about in some theoretical form what it is that's there. And I like the idea of questions of Caribbean as theory, because I think that what that space allows, particularly Haiti, I would want to argue, what it allows for is a certain theorization of Blackness, which needs to be on the agenda. And let me finish there.
I just wanted to kind of, as you were all talking, I was just thinking about a couple of things, and what Anthony just said, but also what Wayne was talking about in this idea of a kind of refusal and absence of Haiti, and what in the archives, and how that perhaps that absence and refusal can be a kind of generative space. And then I started thinking a little bit also about, and questioning the particular kind of presence, though, of Haiti, and what that presence actually is. And if we were to kind of just imagine the images that we're actually even talking about right now, there are images that are, yes, created contemporarily, but they harken back to a particular historical moment. So what is it about the history of Haiti that is so much more generative and of interest than its current presence? So what always excites me, or I want to question, is this inability to actually deal with the present of Haiti, both on the island and the artists working on the island, but also diasporically, those who work diasporically. So what is it about the history of Haiti that is at one point exciting, but at the same time also troubling? But yet more importantly, what is troubling about its presence that we're unable to have, or not quite sure where to have a conversation about contemporary artists who are working with contemporary or in contemporary veins? And that is, I mean, as someone who writes about contemporary Haitian art and part of the Haitian diaspora, I'm always sometimes going up against individuals who might want more of a kind of historical conversation. And I understand the importance of having that kind of historical conversation and entering all of the writers who help us frame that. But there is something about the present of Haiti that is troubling. The present and the presence of Haiti, I think, is very troubling. And until we can actually think about that troubling process, and it might come from what Barry's talking about in this kind of unapologetic Blackness that I think comes out of Haiti. And is that present something that is so fearful, or we're unable to really wrap our minds around? And so I just wanted to put that out there, that while the kind of historical moment and the historical conversations and historical images are vastly important to help us get to a point, but there is also a contemporary moment that we oftentimes let slide by, and we don't really have the opportunity to really kind of engage in those.
Hi, I think I have a response formulated. I mean, but there are two things, a couple of things. In my design, I want us to think about archive as process and more broadly. I'm not always thinking about archive. Know that in my practice, I don't necessarily always think of archive as going to a place and getting papers and et cetera. I just, in terms of absence, just going back to what Wayne's challenge, that has become a challenge for me in terms of looking for an archive. And so recently I was writing on some new work by Edouard Duvall, and I was thinking about just that, about absence and an archive. And what do we imagine an archive can be in the absence of quote unquote presence? And for me, I ended up turning to architecture. I ended up turning to Versailles. And I ended up turning to a particular building in Versailles, a building called the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles that was completed, I think the year of the Code Noir, or the year after. And it was supposed to celebrate France in a certain kind of narrative. but there was no evidence of Haiti. But we know who funded that room, and we know what funded that room. And so archive becomes, for me, archive can also be something that we work through the other side of a mirror or the shadow of it. And I find those kinds of moments almost more interesting or interesting for the possibilities they sort of present in terms of knowledge and how we see things, how we see the past, but also how we think through contemporary work that is engaging a kind of, the past, so to speak. And I think I agree with you completely, Wayne, when you say Caribbean as a kind of theory, because for me, I think I've relied on that idea to sort of give myself permission to push back against my very 19th century discipline, even as I'm incredibly invested in doing work to establish the field, so to speak. And I think about the field, but I also am thinking about it in a non-monumental way, that these processes that we are developing, like Barry just indicated, are not monuments. If we think of the Caribbean theoretically, then we know that we have to think in a more responsive way, right? And that these things are not fixed. They are going to move, just like the way we think of language. We think of Creole. It's constantly, it's alive. And if we sort of bring that sort of sensibility or that ethos to our practice, we're sort of contributing to something, and then in 20 years we understand if we may not be, but for this moment we could develop work that actually can push things in a certain, or open up things in a way that's interesting, but also speaks back to those kinds of absences in places like Europe. Like, really, dude? Really? We know this and we see this, and we are going to tell you how we see it through the work.
Can I just do quickly anecdotal? I totally agree with Tony, and primarily because I'm interested in the work, for example, that has been done in South Africa on the archive with Caroline Hamilton, or actually more recently this amazing book, I think, by Ariela Zule, called which is about questions of archive, like potential histories, it's called. It's a really amazing, very thick book. But also because, and if we were to also go to what Tony is saying, then Saidiya Hartman's notion of the archive of the imagination and the question of critical fabulation. So I agree with that. I understand it. There is a way, though, from my own perspective in Europe as well, though, what I'm interested is also to think of these absences and presences when it comes to the governance of history and how the governance of memory. So, because in a way, one of the things I find strange is that I'm telling tales out of school, so I don't hope nobody hates me, but when the British Museum when it makes statements about the Indian Revolution or the whatever revolution it was, and it puts on exhibition for years, and it is only since recently, 3 years ago, that it put on its first ever exhibition that included anything on the Haitian Revolution, then something is strange, because it's an institution invested so much in empire, but it does not ever say that the revolution happened. And if you saw the exhibition, it could fit in my very tiny apartment in Amsterdam with one image, right? So I'm also interested in that, because when we take a claim in Europe to the Enlightenment and to the French Revolution, we don't stake any claim to Haiti. We don't say that happened as well. We talk about equality, whatever, without Haiti happening. So I'm interested in these double sides of archival absence presence. But my answer comes to Jerry. And Jerry, I want to actually go back to something again Ariela Zule did in her last book before this last one, I think it was the book on the political ontology of photography, where she spoke about the question of the event. And I'm wondering if your suggestion, excuse me if I'm rude here, if your suggestion suggests a schism between present and past that doesn't see the present as part of the ongoing eventfulness of the past. Yeah. That it is actually that artists who are engaging with the present or with the past are actually engaging with the present, because the past is an ongoing event that is recurring and recurring in the present. So yeah. I wonder if you make that dichotomy too strict, because their response is not necessarily to recover the history, but actually to write the history of the present where that history is present. I wonder.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think, if I may, I don't want to take too much, because I know there's some other folks who might want to respond. I mean, I think that here, the teasing, the kind of gentle teasing that you've just done is very interesting. And I'm thinking about the present, but I'm also thinking about the presence, you know, the actual ability to actually be. And while the past is very much part of the present, because it is an ongoing, constantly being rewritten, but what I also want us to think about is that the present, in terms of what is going on right now in Haiti, or what is going on in the diaspora, or what is even going on with artists of Haitian descent who are engaged with other types of artistic practice, or other types of medium, or other types of aesthetic ideas. Those types of present are not oftentimes included in the ongoing present. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah, so it's really to try to tease out what we desire and what we deem as importantness and necessary to visualize. And I think that's the challenge, that if the necessity to visualize is always about a historical, monumental moment, what does that then say about the everyday pushback that Haitians, Caribbean people do every day through visual cultures, through music, through painting, through performance, through film? I think those kinds of present and presence are not included because they don't fall into the nice long history that we imagine of Haiti.
Thank you.
Can I just make?
Sorry. Oh, Patricia, we're gonna, while Patricia is speaking, please type in any questions you might have in the Q&A, because I'm realizing we only have about 30 minutes left. So please type in your questions in the Q&A. After Dr. Moise speaks, I will ask a question, then bring your question in. So please begin typing in the Q&A. Thank you.
And I kind of want to address the absence and the presence. And I was thinking about the artist that I interviewed for my research, and I was thinking about Tessa Mars specifically. And it was, when we talk about archive, in her work, it is about what is missing, the conversations that, because our history is not incorporated, because when she was in school in Europe, she did not see a reflection of herself. So her shadow became to develop Tessaline, and what the conversations that Tessaline was to have in the present, even though she did take a historic persona, but to utilize Tessaline to talk about the language gap, the historical gap, the disconnect of our youth who do not have the memory of the Duvall regime and do not know how to place that in context. So, and then I was thinking about Stéphane Arboit, who utilizes what is organic to Haiti, like coffee and indigo, but at the same time, he refuses to allow to name the piece. He chooses to allow the personality and the work to stay in flux, because he knows that as Dr. Bogus said, that it is going to be different in another 5 or 10, 15 years from now of how we approach this. I don't when I first said archives, I was thinking physical, of the collection of things at first. But then I started to think about, are we just creating in the archives the moment of space for conversation? Because what I've heard from everyone is we are not part of the conversation. So as artists are creating these spaces for having conversation, how do we now open up that conversation to other spaces? As Erica was saying, how can we go across curriculum? How can we go across spaces, like Jerry was saying, that we need to make these moments, because that is what we're doing. We're making markers. But I know that we have short time, so I'll just keep going.
So much. It's very, very rich conversation. Reminding everyone that the Q&A is open. I guess for me, as I'm hearing you all speak, it's hard for me to formulate a question. So maybe take a time to pose your questions in the Q&A. So I have a question I would like to pose the panel. I'm an anthropologist of a strange type. I'm an anthropologist that studies intellectuals and artists. And the future. So one thing with my work in Haiti, living off and on throughout the years, but my last stay for about a year, is what I hear in the conversation is about here's archive work and about the history, the presence and the present of Haiti. One thing I would love to speak about is the future. Because as I'm working with various artists and intellectuals, I noticed that the archives are in their homes. So whether it was sitting with Fignolet, all the records of his books are in his homes, and this kind of distrust of institution and institutionalizing their work because of the history of artists and intellectuals and the state and international actors. So even the question of archives as living and as perhaps domestic and not the state, and also this kind of teaching one another. So going to the Centre d'Art and speaking to people about the crafts of making. I noticed, and I would love for you all to speak to this kind of the present as trying to envision a future, because the present is difficult in its livedness. So a lot of artists and intellectuals, a lot of the young folks of which I spoke, a lot of their work was engaging with the present, whether it was ecological shift, but this moment of crisis and this rapid imagination. So from the people who put film together or sculptures or visual artists and these various mediums is always thinking about Haiti otherwise. And other than this, in conversation with the past, the present, but this kind of, I would call Black futurity kind of emerged for me in the conversations young people were having about not only what has not worked in the past, but that's not working in the present, but how do we create different spaces outside of the state and these institutions for which intellectuals and artists can't really trust to carry and hold their work. And just a lot of the other stuff people were doing, like getting on, let's say, the plane and with the reviews in their backpacks and going to places like France, et cetera, and using Zoom and using all of these platforms to that their archive that they're creating are digital and transnational, but also distrustful, I think, of being held and owned because of the various histories of the burning of art, of, you know, iconoclastic kind of measures by the state, et cetera. So I wondered if that comes up in your exploration about the ways in which art creation now, and maybe the question of the Haitian Futurity. There's this book that, it's a chord that I don't quite like, but it's being this narrative that keeps coming up. Haiti is the place with no future, keeps coming up. And I found artists and intellectuals really pushing back against this idea that there is no future or that there is no more Haiti. Thank you.
I'll take a stab at that. As you're talking, the thing that I was thinking about was the fact of to be friendly, you have to be found friendly. And in my engagement with interviewing the artists for my work was the belief that it was one and done, like the interview was just going to be a 6-hour or 3-hour interview, or well, really 30 minutes, but turned into 6 hours. And the fact that I wanted to come back. I wanted to come back while the piece was being done. I wanted to come back a year from now. I wanted to see their perspective of growth. I think that the reason, and it was, I forgot who said it. It was just kind of like we're stuck in this time frame of just discussing 1804 or just discussing 1945, because we don't go back and say, where are we now? Who I am at 20. I can talk to you about what I was at 20, at 50, because now I have perspective. And even though I remember that moment, I can build on that moment and how has that progressed me? How many times are we going back to those artists and saying, going back to that piece and reevaluating that piece and giving context and depth? And one of the things that this pandemic has done is made everybody sit down and have to look at the depth of our engagement. Not only now are we are now valuing what we are engaging and making sure that we use our time wisely. Now we are actually looking at the depth of that relationship, of those conversations, of being on the phone for 10 minutes. So now if we're all talking about bringing the artists forward with their work and changing that dynamic, like Artistes Rezistans did. Artistes Rezistans took away the dynamics of just going off to the gallery. They decided to change the paradigm and say, bring the academics to Grand Rue, right? Engage with Grand Rue, let us work together. Let us build dialogue. I think that if we move forward by building that dialogue and building the depth in the relationship of watching an artist grow and allow their narrative, their evaluation of saying, this is the work that I think of, and as opposed to outside. And not to say that outside doesn't have a value. I think what our perspectives does bring about value. But I think that right now, if we want to really go beyond provenance, we have to build that landscape and we have to build the context and the depth to it. And I believe that is in building relationship and going beyond teaching future researchers that is just, oh, just get your interview, move on, document it, but build the relationship, invest in that. And I think it will invest in the change.
Yeah, and if I may add, I think this is where we come in as intellectual. I always make a disclaimer when I'm surrounded by the art historian colleagues. I am not an art historian. I am trained, I'm a literary and cultural studies scholar, but I had the great fortune back in my years as a PhD student and met Ulrich Jean-Pierre when I was at Tulane in New Orleans, and I fell in love with his art and with Haitian art because that allowed me a space to have complex and lively and rich conversation with my students about Haiti, what they thought Haitian art was, what they thought Haiti was. So I think it's up to us, whether we are ethnologists, anthropologists, historian, whether we're teaching language, to show images of Haiti, not just one token artist, because that's what also happens. And this is where the idea of the language becomes problematic. Everybody quotes just one person. This is why some respected in the US context scholars could dare say in a form that they are no Haitian art historian, because as Jerry mentioned earlier, they only quote that one person. So we have to be mindful and make sure we are quoting Haitian scholars. For me, it is not acceptable if you're going to be working in the space of Haiti to not at least find a graduate student, somebody to translate for you in French and Haitian Creole. And that's this problem. So we must decolonize our syllabus. We must decolonize that space by choosing to show artists that are in Haiti, that are working in Haiti. and having that conversation.
There's a small project that I'm working on now, which I can't tell you too much about, but it is concerned very much with Jamaica and art practice, art infrastructure. And one of the things in your question, Darlene, right, that I'd love to kind of pull out is a certain, and I'm not saying you intended this, a certain exceptionalism and tragedy that I hear, not in you, but what you're saying others say. Because one of the things I would be interested in, and this is not necessarily, it is to ask, what kind of art infrastructure does the Caribbean have or has had that can help us to fashion that kind of futurity that you're speaking about? Because one of the things I think we also have not yet written, and I was talking about this in relationship to Jamaica recently, that in as much as the place is messed up and in its art infrastructure now, it is not an easy place to be. There has been intellectual and infrastructural mechanism created for an art infrastructure in Jamaica that has existed since the 1930s, the 40s, the 50s. We can criticize it in any way we want, but it has been there. And I'm interested in that, especially because as I see the struggles over what an art infrastructure in Jamaica can continue to become, very many people forget that that existed. They forget that Rex Nettleford, in all of his craziness, had with others connected the art school together with the Institute of Jamaica, together with the whatever, and all of that was conjoined in a really convoluted way. But notwithstanding, it maintained an ecology for art practice that also has a history. So I would be interested to ask of you, how might we trace that kind of infrastructural history as well as a part of the futures that we want to create? Because even in the precarity of art practice in Haiti, going back to the 40s might have been something about that infrastructure, that it was there. And I'm interested in understanding that infrastructure as a grounding for where we go next. What is at stake? Erica participated in a dialogue here in the Netherlands around Caribbean art infrastructures, where we criticized everything and a comparative criticism of how it didn't work and whatever. But I think that that would be my first point. How do we also write that history of the infrastructures that exist as part of futures that we need to create within art practice in the Caribbean? So that's my first thing. My second thing is, I guess it ties back to this, to a certain kind of tragedy. And one could also say a David Scott tragedy as well, about the Caribbean in a certain sense, that although David would never do this, but that tries to deny it of futures. And I wonder, why would we even go there? This denial of possible futures. Because if it's anything else that I see anyway, not necessarily in Haiti, because that is not where I'm comfortable with, but in Jamaica, for example, especially, and this probably happens much more in popular culture, so music, it might be hard, it might be terrible, it might be struggles, but there's no way people aren't imagining futures. There's no way. And in that sense, I make a distinction in my own work between optimism and hope, because hope is the imagination of possible futures. Optimism is a little bit useless for me. Hope is what people imagine when there is nothing to imagine, when there's nothing to fight, when you think that it cannot go further. And that is what enslaved life does for you, because enslaved peoples could hope even when there was no optimism. So I would be interested in writing these futures of optimism, of hope, which I think is about the futurity that you're talking about. And at the same time, from your perspective as an anthropologist, one of the things I get a little bit troubled by is when we try to see too much hope and deny precarity and violence. I also get annoyed, a little bit difficult with that, because anthropologists are always trying to theorize precarity without seeing precarity, and yeah, that doesn't do much for me.
We have another question from the audience. I guess I will address very quickly Wayne's comment. So in my work, the institution making was, yes, it's Santiago, but also transnationally, also in the cracks. It wasn't where you are taught to look at it from a Eurocentric perspective. I guess that's what I came out with my work. It's what I'm calling the spaces in between. That people know about, but that you're not educated to look for art and collection and creation in these spaces in between that you know of if you're in the ground working an artist. Like, how do you learn this particular craft? People know who this artist tradition and where you find it and how one does it right and how one teaches it. But we're not necessarily taught to look in particular places in the Laku. We're taught to look at particular, I guess that's what I'm saying, is what can we, in terms of reckoning with this epistemicide, how can we recognize the different spaces where this archival work is happening, that we are in a way of re-educating ourselves through these conversations, relationships, I think Francisca and Erica and Jerry have spoken about. The question is from, as a filmmaker, I strive to engage, I put it in the chat as well, with Haiti's history through my work. How should or can artists integrate their point of view, especially when they are part of the diaspora?
I don't know if Jerry wants to answer that.
Huh?
If you want to take that up, Jerry.
No, I was just thinking, and as I was looking at the question, and I would say, why not? Why not? You know, my answer to be, and it's not to mean anyway to dismiss the answer, but it's really say, well, absolutely. I mean, I think that if there is a particular history that an artists are engaged in, I don't think our role as academics are to kind of craft how artists engage in the kinds of interrogations that they want to engage in. I think they should be open to interrogating however they are, wherever they happen to be placed, whether it's on the island or in the diaspora. So my answer would be absolutely would be my answer. I do want to just take up one thing, and it just kind of goes back to what we were saying. I don't want to take up too much time because I know we might have some more questions. I want to think about the space of the Centre d'Art and thinking about Wayne's question about infrastructure and thinking about that space, and even as a problematic space that it was. We know the history of the Centre, we know the foundation, the formation of the Centre. But when I think about the Centre, I think about Peters and all the other, and all the complexities that occurred in the formation of what we understand as Haitian art. But I also see it as a kind of fruitful space of modernity. Think about all of the African-American, other Caribbean artists who came into that space, who actually worked with artists, and in a way kind of created a space that allowed for thinking about the folk, thinking about place, thinking about modernity at a point where that type of conversation did not exist in the United States. That is why many African-American artists actually went to those spaces to actually, in a sense, to kind of find Blackness. So I I guess basically what I'm saying is, as we think about the sum, it is not something that we need to throw away, and I'm not suggesting that we are. But if we can actually think about it as a space that actually opened up the discourse of what it meant to actually create Blackness and what it meant to actually engage in Blackness at a moment, 1944, at a moment that may not have existed so easily for African Americans and other artists who went there. But secondly, it is a space that's being created along political lines in Haiti, along cultural lines in Haiti, along the moment when the idea of tourism in Haiti is kind of burgeoning and thinking about. So I think the Sum is a space that, yes, offers complications, but it is still under, I think, theorized as a space that actually allowed for conversations about Black art, not Haitian art specifically or only, but Black art particularly.
Yeah, could I just say something that I agree with Jerry, because to think through that complication is not, it means not to foreground DeWitt Peters, but actually to foreground the other Haitian intellectuals who worked there. And the arguments that that are between DeWitt Peters and some of them that can be found now in the archives of the Center. And what is important, I think, is to, and here I'm thinking particularly of Wilfredo Lam, and I'm thinking of his visit and then of the ways in which the arguments that then led to Haitian artists going to Havana. Because DeWitt was saying, no, they shouldn't go to Havana. They can't go to Havana. They are not up to scratch of the Cuban artists. And then there were people in Haitian intellectuals and Cubans who had there who were saying, no, that's not true. Look at the work that's there. And that's how the first Haitian exhibition that does not go to Paris, but actually ends up in Havana. So it becomes a complicated space. So I would want to agree with you. And I would also agree with you that in its reimagining of itself, it is also a very important archival space. And one should just pay attention to that. But I want to come back to the archives, because I myself share a lot of what Wayne's and what everybody has been saying about archive. But I also have a real deep concern. And it is this, that trying to work, for example, on Andre Pierre. The archive on Andre Pierre is in a house of a lady who I will not mention, where he painted. You can't write a biography about him without those paintings that exist in that house. But there's no way you can get, they will allow you to even begin to take photographs of some of those paintings, because it's seen as a kind of personal property of a collector, hoping that somehow later on the price of the art will be astronomical and it can be then sold in Miami or wherever. But there are other places like that in Haiti. There are places where art has been collected. You want to look at a piece or talk about a piece and so on. And that there's no way you can get access to those. So for me, the artistic visual archive becomes important. When I hear our colleague Darlene talks about stuff that's held in people's places, I cringe, and I understand the relationship to the state, but I cringe because I have memories of hurricanes, right, in Jamaica, in Barbados, and people's archives swimming down rivers or swimming down, swimming in streets. And so I have all the arguments about archive, but I'm also have a very practical thing about how, in the name of God, in the Caribbean, can we begin to make sure that some of the archives, whether they're visual, whether they're literary, whatever they are kept in places that would allow us, not even me or even you, but allow another generation to begin to think through these questions. Because there is there isn't a, and I can speak about Jamaica much more than Haiti, but there is a kind of amnesia, right? And that amnesia is constructed deliberately by power, by imperialism, or whatever you want to call it. And so that what you then find is that there's no particular connection. So the present, Jerry, becomes just the present. It's like instant coffee. It doesn't have any connection to anything, right? And so neither to a future, unless it is a certain kind of future that you can imagine in a certain way. So how to begin to think about as intellectuals and so on, ways and projects that can actually do some work in the archive. And I am against a kind of storage thing and so on, but I also am not stupid enough to see when somebody writes and say, Henry B. Moore's archive, Tony, just went down. It was deceased, the box was down and going down on the street in Barbados. I mean, it pains me personally, because I have to say that that's a kind of intellectual heritage and tradition that is gone and will never come back. Anyway, I just thought I'd make that. Sorry.
I think it's the complicated questions, because now you entering into the realms of the irresponsibility of the government, the lack of cultural preservation. There isn't a politic of what art means, and we will have to get into all that, and we have to get into the lack of responsibility of the intellectuals and the so-called bourgeois class, who's not putting money into the country, who's exploiting the artists. So you bring, that's kind of like a whole other HSA session.
I agree with you. Sorry, Wayne, I agree with you. But I also just like to think that when we speak, and those of us who are committed to some of these things, that we also need to think very concretely and practically sometimes. Is there something that can be done? Nothing, perhaps something can be done.
But can I just say that I'm going to leave with this, right? And Tony, forgive me for doing this. I love you, right? So we've gone through a lot together. But I wonder to what extent, sorry, Tony, don't get upset at me. But I wonder to what extent you reproduce an imperial act there. That in itself sounds like the history of archival project is the history of Europe's need to know, and therefore their need to have access to the archive to be able to write particular histories. So how do we ensure that by doing what you suggest, we do not reproduce the imperial act that says the North Atlantic needs to have access to be able to write the histories that they need to write? Hold on, because I think that is exactly what I mean by this very gentle and tense relationship between the ability to lose, the idea of loss and invisibility, and that relationship to the imperial impulse to say that it should be there for us. And I give you one other reason why I say that. Because if you were to look at the archives that Europe has collected from the beginning of the colonial project, those archives have not necessarily been in the service of those they colonized. So my question then would be, how in our attempt to retain, to keep, so that we can know, we do not participate in another kind of we know over here and they don't over there. No, I'm cautious of that.
No, but Wayne, I would agree with you. And I mean, right. I agree with your thing. I mean, I agree with you, but that's the perspective, and I'm not talking to a group of white Europeans. Talking to a Caribbean, people talking to about a group.
I do want to add two comments that were mentioned. One is somebody made a comment and say that the person say, I was struck by the mention that a recent exhibition in Britain made no mention of the Haitian Revolution. It brought Michel Wolf-Trouillot immediately to mind, and the notion that the Haitian Revolution was and remains unthinkable. Moreover, the British addressed the Haitian Revolution, they will also have to address their slave owning and obscene profits they made from the slave trade. Much easier to cast themselves as holding the moral high ground in comparison to the US in the 19th century. And somebody else in regarding archives and the discussion about archive, how come the documentaries by Arnaud Lantonet about Haitian artists were not mentioned among Desmandry Pierre, Cédor Tiga, Dufault Maritou, La Fortune Félix, etc. And I also want to add that oftentimes I'm amused when reading about the Centre d'Art, because as a literary scholar, I think about the fact that Emperor Suluk already in, I think, 1856, thereabout, founded the Imperial Academy of the Arts. So
Yes.
it's absurd to me, the notion that this American came and, suddenly invented art. But, then later earlier Christophe, we can think about all this and those very building or archives. When we go to the Citadel, when we think of Palais Sans Souci, which, we can have a whole discussion about the lack of preservation, but they are archives. And we can think about the whole film industry. But I don't know how it works with the Zoom room, but I just want to thank each and every one of you. I want to thank Alexandra Benedicti Coquen, who organized all this. I see she put on the link to Arnaud Lantonet's film. So a big thanks to the attendee who brought that to our attention. I had also mentioned A Nation of Artists by Jacques Constant. So there are a lot of artists, filmmakers who are representing art, who are creating their own archives. And don't forget the work that many digital humanists are doing, and work that new scholars such as Dr. Petrushka Moise are also doing. So I want to thank Carlo Celius, Alessandra Benedicti Kaken, a special thanks to Darlene Dubuisson, as well as Julio Perez, who's being, making sure all the technology works. I also want to remind you there are other working sessions. There's one on Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken, Darlene, one on Wednesday and on Thursday about the environment, about this, and one on Thursday about living creatively. So
Thursday is a nice conversation with this. It's about contemporary artists and living creatively and LGBTQ plus issues in Haiti.
yes, so I hope we will have other spaces to continue this conversation. Thank you to each and every one of you. And please check out the conference online. And if you can, I just want to make a plug that this year the conference is free, but we take donation, especially in pounds, sterling, and euros, those of you in Europe. So we appreciate your time. So Wayne, especially for you, Wayne. I'm just saying.
Okay.
Thank you to each of you for your time. Professor Barry Bourbourgs, Professor Wayne Modeste, Professor Petrushka Moise, Professor Darlene Dubuisson, Professor Thierry Philogène. So thank you, Aibobo, merci en pile, and thank you again to the organizers of HSC, the moderator, and there's a whole team of people making this happen. So thank you, everyone. Merci en pile.
Merci bien,
Merci.
merci.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Julio, if I pause recording, it goes to the cloud. I'm so confused.
I think whenever